Listen-only mode.
We're live and recording.
Good morning or good afternoon, depending where you are. This is Alan Schimmel, Editor-in-Chief of Devops.com. Thanks for joining us today on another Devops.com webinar. And we are going to get started in just another minute or two. We'll allow for late arrivals to log in as they normally do. While we're waiting for late arrivals, for those of you on, just little bit of information about our GoToWebinar control panel, which we utilize for our webinars. Hopefully the GoToWebinar control panel is in the right-hand side or the right-hand corner of your screen, and you will see it's broken into several sections. One of the sections is marked questions, and that's really the most important thing for today's webinar for attendees. We have set aside time for questions at the conclusion of today's presentation. And what we ask is that rather than waiting for the end of the presentation to ask your questions, if you can type in your questions in real time, they will be saved and in chronological order so we can get to them at the conclusion of today's presentation. We find it helps also because a lot of people sometimes will have a question about something early on in the presentation and then perhaps forget it by the time we get to the end of the presentation with all of the information going back and forth each way. So again, we'll ask that you type in your questions in the questions section. Secondly, there is a chat section down at the bottom, and we use this primarily if you are having any technical difficulties, perhaps with audio or video. Our engineers are on call and monitoring the chat session, so if you were to type something in there, we can reach out to you and try to correct anything in real time. Though, frankly, we very rarely have any problems with the GoToWebinar system. I also wanted to mention, before we get started, that as a thank you for attending today's webinar, we will be sending out an email with the slides and the survey report, which is the subject matter of today's webinar. So all of you in attendance and who have registered will be receiving a copy of the State of On-Call survey and slides as well. With that being said, we're about 2 minutes after the hour, and let's get started. For those of you who weren't here just a few minutes ago, my name is Alan Schimmel, and I am the Editor-in-Chief of Devops.com. Today, we're very lucky to have a webinar sponsored by our friends at Devops, and it is a deep dive into their State of On-Call survey, which this is now, I believe, the second, or I believe it's the second annual survey they've done, and we're very lucky to be joined by an old friend of mine, Todd Vernon, who is the CEO of Devops. Todd, welcome.
Thank you, Alan. Great to be here.
Thank you. And we have two other friends of mine from Devops. We have Tara Kalman. Tara, you there?
Hi, Alan.
Hi. And we are also joined by Joni. And Joni, I'm not sure how to pronounce the last name. I'm going to let you pronounce it.
It's Clifford. Thanks so much, Alan.
Good.
Thank you. And a special thanks for all three of you, because we know there's a heavy snowstorm out in Boulder, and you guys have braved the elements to appear on the webinar today. So thank you.
You bet. A lot of snow out there at the mountain base camp at Devops.
Yes. Okay. Well, that makes a case for why we want to do these in person in Florida, but that's another day. So, Todd, this is the second State of On-Call survey, isn't it, or is it the third now?
It's the second. We decided, a couple of years, almost 3 years ago now, that we wanted to track this. Mostly because there's a pretty substantial change in behavior about how technology organizations are responding to problems and solving problems in real time. And we recognized that when we started the company, so that we thought it would be fun to to do this every year just to sort of measure how that's changing in a pretty rapidly evolving space.
Great. All right, why don't we dive right in, and Tara, if you've got control of the slides, I believe.
Cool. Yeah, and just for reference, Tara is in our marketing group. She's the voice of VictorOps on Twitter, and she also ran this whole process of collecting this data. She did a great job, and Joni Clippard is our VP of Product, and I'll invite them to talk to certain slides kind of along the way. So if we sort of kick it off with the first slide, it's just sort of the summary if you didn't have a ton of time to read the rest of it. Some of these things aren't big shockers, but alert fatigue among the people who responded, they would say it's still getting worse, right? And it's mostly the fatigue part, I think, that they're talking about. And this is, we'll talk about it a little bit later, but it really stems from the explosion of monitoring systems, right? Where it used to be you'd have just a few monitoring systems. Now most organizations have as many as 5 or 6 or even more, and that's causing a lot of fatigue because of just constantly being alerting. And recipients said that went up this year about 10%. 52% report that it's actually starting to kind of get a little better in general, and I think that's because of the whole idea of and I think this encompasses a lot of things. Am I being alerted, but also how many people are involved in it. There's a lot more attention paid to this space than there was a year ago, so you see that movement in the data on that second bullet there. The other thing we uncovered, adoption of automation tools continues to grow. I don't think that's a shocker to anybody who's involved in DevOps practices. I know it's certainly true of our business. I've had 3 businesses, and we push to production a lot now, right? Several times a week, whereas historically, it hasn't been that way. So automation tools are key to that, obviously. Yeah, email is still the #1 way people find out about problems, and that's unfortunate. And a lot of it, the reason we say it's unfortunate is, we see a lot of customers come to us because once it hits your email, it just becomes this giant bag of stuff, and you can't really do anything with it. So we'll talk a little bit about that later as we dig into it. We're seeing more companies be a lot more kind of visible with the health of their systems by using various status page kind of technology. So that basically they're owning up to problems sooner for their customer base and their partners. So it's not so much a badge of dishonor to have a technical problem anymore. I think really progressive companies have figured out, hey, to be progressive and to be quick, you can't be afraid to break things, but you have to own it if you do it. And we definitely saw that in the data. And ChatOps is gaining in popularity. We're a huge proponent of ChatOps. Jason, one of our evangelists, wrote a book about it. So ChatOps is a big deal. A much larger jump this year at 40%. Reported the use of ChatOps up from 28% last year. I'm not going to read the next slide, the motivation slide. I've talked a little bit about sort of the motivation, but I will touch on a few kind of high-level aspects about motivation. As I talked about in the opening, there is a definite shift in the way technology organizations are interfacing with their own companies, right? It used to be the guys who kind of made the machines work, wrote the software. They were sort of disconnected from the company. They weren't involved in all the business decisions. They weren't directly tied to revenue. And that behavior we're seeing change a lot, right? And it's definitely one of the tenets of DevOps is this notion of being much more connected to the business, that is a critical part of the revenue generating machine and the customer experience, and being able to change your software rapidly is a key advantage. But with this, we're seeing some pretty interesting kind of fundamental shifts. And one of these I put in the category of there's actually the notion that operations as a job is kind of going away as an independent job. What's happening now is, developers are getting much more involved in the front line of remediation. You're even seeing pretty dramatic shifts in the way companies are starting to deal with network operation centers. We see this a lot where, network operation centers used to be this awesome kind of, catch-all for technical problems and communicating information out to external contingents. And what we're seeing is a lot of companies have found that the network operations or NOC model isn't working for them in rapid deployment world, where they have to change the software all the time. NOCs are sort of built to remediate problems that reoccur over and over again, so you don't have to reach into engineering. But with these organizations that are rapidly changing their software and innovating, all the things that go wrong are different every time. So the NOC is kind of getting in the way of remediation on the technical side. There's still somewhat of a job for them on of problems out to external contingents, but that's where we're seeing kind of the status page stuff sort of plug in. So between kind of the world we live in and sort of this adoption of status page technologies, in many companies we're seeing the NOC go away, and I can talk a little bit about that later. But together, this is a pretty dynamic kind of universe that's happening right now, and that was part of the motivation of why we did this survey.
Excellent.
Yeah.
So, Todd, and feel free for Joni and Tara to kick in here. What's it going to take to kill email, guys?
I think it's the proliferation of technologies and companies like ours and maybe some of our competitors, that it's just this notion of it's a real-time thing now, right? I mean, like a great example is, over 50% of the logins in our platform are mobile every day, right? A push notification is so much more effective than getting an email that just goes into a bucket somewhere. You can't necessarily make your phone make a different sound when it gets. You don't know the difference between the printer is broken and my sister's coming over for dinner, right? They make the same sound on my phone. Whereas if you have a dedicated application for it, now you can really kind of get in on the problem really quickly and communicate with other people. So I just think it's kind of what more you can do with it that will eventually kind of win the day, and we see that in our customer base for sure.
I'll add a little bit more to that too. I think about this stat all of the time because it bothers me so much that people are still using email. And I think it has to do a lot also with the discipline of ensuring that you are alerting your operations people and your developers on the right things. And so because there is so much noise in people's systems, by default, they don't want their phone blowing up. And so it's going to take a lot of rigor and practice to ensure that, after there's a paging event or, your on-call handoff, you are going through all of your alarms and ensuring that they are indeed actionable. And as people's processes also about that get more mature, I think they'll start taking more advantage of their tools to be.
That's right.
Yep.
Excellent.
I wonder how much so, Todd,
Yeah.
we're probably of a different generation than a lot of the people who took this survey. I see it with my own children and millennials who work here for us at Devops.com. They're not as email dependent as we were.
No, I think you make a good point, and this also kind of goes into another behavioral pattern we've noticed. We have a lot of media companies as customers, and what we've seen with them is when they implement something, like our system, they're implementing them on new development efforts that they're doing within those companies, and this is where they're end running their NOCs. They're saying, you know what, our NOC just doesn't work anymore, so this new system we're building, we are going to implement your technology. And it tends to be the younger people that are implementing, these new services. So I think there is a generational aspect to it. And they want a completely different behavioral pattern, everywhere from disintermediating the NOC to being able to get, push alerts and being able to talk to, different members of the team. Their just behavioral pattern is much more DevOps, much more different. Whereas the kind of the classic engineers and the classic NOC and operations are sort of running, the older systems, and they're not going to change those necessarily. They're just going to let their systems evolve and change their behavior as they go.
Yep, fair enough.
Cool. All right.
Excellent. Let's talk a little bit about who took this survey. So we reached out to people who are actually doing the hard job of being on call, or those who are managing teams of on-call folks. So that would be operations, system admins, developers, IT, and programmers. And as you can see on the graphic in the slide, the majority of the people were from larger companies, which was a little surprising, but I think a hopeful sign that these larger and enterprise customers are out there and wanting to do DevOps and wanting to make their on-call process better. The majority of the people, the industries that were represented, are those, pretty obviously, that depend on their website to make money. So that would be SaaS companies, e-commerce, media, entertainment, internet service, whatnot. So those are the majority of the people that answered the questions in our survey.
Yeah, and I think it's important to note too that the people who answered the survey were not our customer base. They were a cross-section across, partners such as Devops.com that helped us get this survey out there, as well as just other channels we use to gain the results. So they should not be statistically skewed towards anybody's solution or behavior. Instead, it's a pretty legitimate cross-section.
Sure. Hey, Tara, if you don't mind, one of the things that I always find fascinating about the truth behind DevOps is that, there's a lot of horses out there. Financial services company, insurance companies, manufacturing companies. Sherwin-Williams, 100-year-old paint company, is presenting at DevOps Enterprise Summit about how they're using DevOps. What about these old sort of quote-unquote old line companies? Were they represented in the survey as well?
They definitely are, just not to the same percentage as the others. I feel like, as you were saying, they are definitely getting their horses in the race, and they are trying to learn more about DevOps. I feel like in the larger companies, it just takes a little bit longer to get some of these initiatives up and running. But they were definitely, we definitely had some people from very, very large companies that were answering the questions.
Sometimes, Alan, we joke because it depends how customers engage us, at a business level. Sometimes, literally the person who's engaging us has come for the DevOps, right? I mean, and it tends to be kind of a change agent in the company who's either been told to, figure this stuff out, or they've taken it upon themselves to do things in a new way. And for the really kind of immature companies in the space, they can be very large companies, but they have somebody. It's literally they say things like that, the DevOps. And then the more mature ones are the ones that are running their, existing processes, like we talked about a minute ago. So there's definitely kind of people on the spectrum of adoption here, but it's a very rapid adoption.
Got it.
Joni, why don't you talk to infrastructure and automation a little bit?
Yeah, so when we're talking about sort of the source of where all these alerts are coming from, we like to understand where our customers and other people in the space are hosting their applications. So up from last year, we're at about 11% increase in cloud adoption over bare metal. I think a lot of this is a combination of both in terms of co-located types of facilities. And as you can imagine, tools like Puppet and Chef have continued to take off. This has a lot to do with automation as a key tenet of DevOps, but it also has a lot to do with the kind of infrastructure that you're using. So 70% reported using automation tools, which was up from 58% last year.
Yeah, and this is pretty. I cross-referenced some of this data with RightScale did a State of the Cloud survey and came up with very similar numbers in terms of this kind of adoption. And some of the other research I've done in this area suggests it's like almost every company is doing something in the cloud. It's just whether they would kind of self-declare that as critical to their mission or more experimental. So I think it's important to kind of look at those numbers that way too.
Absolutely. Guys, did you look at numbers that would indicate sort of hybrid use, companies that are using metal and cloud?
We didn't, but that same study that I just referenced talked about that quite a bit, which again was the RightScale thing. Hybrid is a very, it's kind of the reality of what you have to do if you have an established enterprise that have done, that's done a lot historically with metal. I will say also, based on my, personal experience, having been in had a media company, essentially an ad tech company previously, is there are still areas of, I would say, of kind of infrastructure build out and operations where the cloud doesn't work as well as metal, and that's high transaction kinds of companies such as ad tech. You'd be hard pressed to find an ad tech company that isn't running on bare metal still today, and even though they're very progressive companies, but they just need the throughput. So I think that's really common. If you take the ad tech, that's sort of one end of the spectrum. I think if you look at enterprise, they're sort of doing this hybrid thing, and then sort of the classic startup universe, they're on Amazon and things like that. So it's a pretty split universe still. That but it's definitely all going to the cloud. I think everyone would agree with that.
Excellent.
Yeah, one of the things we found out, that it shouldn't be a shocker, is Devops is maturing. I will say it is maturing at a rate that I find amazing. Like literally every day we talk to some company that is a well-established, very large brand that you would recognize, and they are really trying to figure this out. And it's really, in my opinion, it's really driven by, in a lot of cases, SaaS as a business model. They have realized that the maturity of the tools now between agile software development and the ability to deploy quickly has really unlocked their ability to innovate their product faster, which is the whole promise of a SaaS business. And they're leaning in, a lot. So they're really trying to figure out what DevOps means to them. And they would, sort of self-declare that the most important principles they're employing or trying to figure out is, one, automation, which directly goes to the statement I just made, but also culture. They sort of recognize this as a cultural shift. And something I had mentioned earlier, you really see the companies that embrace this stuff have really come to grips with the fact that they will break things into production in production. It's just how fast you solve the problem that really matters. If you're trying to keep production pristine, that means you're not innovating and you're not pushing code there, and it's just not a successful kind of model for the future.
So this is one of my favorite slides from our survey, because we asked people about whether or not on-call is actually getting any better, and then we give them a little text box and ask them to leave comments about the best part of being on call. It sort of restores some of my hope in humanity, knowing that people actually enjoy being on call. But you can see some of the answers there. People like to solve problems. They like to help customers out. They like to experience new challenges. The one that I think is especially pertinent to our talk today is the fact, the fourth quote on the slide says, "We leverage the insight gained from our on-call rotations as the primary catalyst and feedback loop to drive improvement in our DevOps capabilities." I mean, that's everyone's hope, right, is that you're getting better after each outage, that you're learning things, that you're improving your process. One of the questions we asked was around the top 4 pain points of being on call. And as you can see on the slide, alert fatigue, as we've already discussed, is huge. People aren't sure what's happening across all the systems, right? So they have all these monitoring tools, and it can be hard to sort of get the whole picture of what's happening. Additionally, leaders in the organization don't know what's going on. So that can be really hard when you are in the middle of a firefight trying to communicate to other stakeholders within the company. And then additionally, when you're on call, if you don't know how to solve the problem, that is very stressful. That is an anxiety-ridden situation there. So it's, the good news is that a lot of people say that the problems around being on call are kind of getting better, but there's definitely room for improvement.
And I think it's the attention to the space that makes them say it's getting better. I think historically, there's just been no sympathy, right? I mean, you had a couple guys who just kept, passing the virtual pager around, and there was no notion higher level in the company that this was even happening, that they were saving the system every night, and there was, kind of no visibility, which now there's a lot. There's more visibility, which I think is making the conversation happen, which is making them feel slightly better about it, even in the face of more fatigue.
Yep.
And then,
I mean, go ahead, Joni.
no, go ahead, Alan.
I was going to say, Todd, to amplify what you're saying, I think that's dead on. You know, it's interesting. I was at a conference a couple of weeks ago, and a woman from a large enterprise said, you know, she was kind of against this whole DevOps thing because it introduced so many instabilities into their product and into their processes. And the fact of the matter is, I think DevOps makes your product more stable and more rock solid. The key to it is no one's putting half-baked, half-cocked stuff up into the cloud or in SaaS, but what they are doing is they're putting more of it up quickly, maybe in smaller pieces, and the feedback loop, which is really what our, you know, on-call has so accelerated and enabled these short feedback loops to get that information, find out when there's an event or an incident or something that needs to be looked at, you know, get the right people on it, fix it, move on to the next thing. That's such an integral part of the whole DevOps process now, and of, you know, improving the feedback loops, that on-call isn't the sleepy guy in the back of the room who's, you know, doing customer service or whatever we want to call them. He you know, they're front line now, and I think, you know, that's part of a big part of the DevOps equation.
Yeah, and it actually feeds really good into the next slide, because this slide's a really good example of how things is different in the general population of how we did the survey versus stuff we see every day. You know, the majority of respondents in the survey have 2 to 5 people that make up an on-call team. And the stuff you just mentioned, it's really hard for a team that big to really effectively support the kind of businesses we've been talking about. And this is, I think, where you see some of the fatigue and some of the consternation that come up. Because really what we see in our customer base, which I think is probably a little more progressive than the general survey, is they're putting more and more and more people on call. Our number one title of people that are on call across our system, across our companies, is software developer. So what we're seeing happen is they're putting much larger groups of people in on-call and in different escalation scenarios, but they're using rules engines and things to route those problems to very specific people. So it can be counterintuitive to somebody who hasn't, you know, thought about it or is new to the space, but the more people you actually make on-call for a system, the easier the job is, because 1, you spread the load out, but 2, you're much more likely to actually receive a problem you can solve, which cuts down the stress and that fatigue part that you saw earlier. So this is one of those things I think you're going to see a lot of change in the next few years as people start to, you know, really utilize much more advanced systems than they've kind of historically used here. You do see the cross group of people here: operations, IT, developers, DevOps, and support. But like I said, in the more progressive organizations, these tend to be, you know, first line are the guy that wrote the code. You know, it's not by definition somebody that can't solve the problem. And those are the more progressive organizations for sure. Maybe Joni can talk to the SaaS on-call management tools slide there.
Yeah, it's really that tooling in this space is really beginning to mature. So on the first survey that we did last year, it's a surprising statistic then, and here it's a huge disparity now, is that 70% of people said that they built something homegrown to manage this job and to manage their systems. And this year, only 25% of the people who responded to the survey said that they had built an internal system for managing their on-call processes. So people are really starting to grab onto the various tools in the market to help them mature this area of their business. And as Todd was speaking to earlier, this is your center of revenue. Things cannot go down. You have to have maturity in both tooling and processes in order to ensure that your company is doing well and making money. So we do go in a little bit deeper, and we ask people if you have used a homegrown solution, and many of them volunteer this information in the additional information box, is they do not recommend using a homegrown solution because it just doesn't scale, right? And you don't know how much time and money you're spending on managing that solution. And I find it fascinating when people talk about building this tooling, particularly at scale, because they're not spending that time and energy building the application that actually drives revenue for their business. And then what's hard is, if you get all the way to the step where you're able to allow somebody to get notified of a problem, you miss out on capturing all of that remediation data or the ability to pull reports and ultimately just get better at doing this job. And so it was interesting and I think a positive move in the marketplace to see that people are deciding not to cobble this stuff together on their own. They're investing in tools that are purpose-built for this domain.
Yeah, and what I would also add that a lot of times, it seems like a good idea to build it yourself, and these are creative people, right? They have the ability to build parts of this and build it together, but what they typically don't build is all the reporting infrastructure to know how well it's working, right? They're concentrated on finding out that there's a problem and maybe, making sure that different people know about it. But then there's no way to kind of analytically look at how the team is doing or whether it's improving, because you just don't build that part of the system. It's not the fun part to build. Whereas if you, adopt, a SaaS offering like ours or maybe parts of our competitors' offerings, you get the reporting and you can just kind of get better over time.
But guys, isn't that sort of the classic? Isn't this sort of the classic conundrum? Todd, as an entrepreneur, hey, seems to me this is a problem in search of a solution, right? If people are building all of these homegrown tools to try to deal with a problem, it's screaming out for a solution. Right. And so I think the really important thing is, we live in such crazy condensed time frames now that in 1 year, 12 months, we saw the number drop from over 70% to 25%. So, I mean, in days gone by, you wouldn't see that rapid an adoption, within a 12-month period, I think. But I think it speaks both to the quality of the solutions out there and also the time, the condensed time frames we operate in today in business.
Yeah, no, I actually do think it's driven by the business side. We have to get better with this. I mean, we hear this every single day. It's like, I don't know how many times somebody has said to us, my job is to, take our traditional operations or our kind of the deployment chain in our SaaS business from 1986 to 2015. Like, that's how they self-describe their business. So they, it's a very acute pain, which makes obviously the space attractive to us, but also it's just it's a very fast-moving thing in what's going on in sort of IT and software development and SaaS in general.
Yep.
Alerting and monitoring, I'll take this one. We talked about email still being the #1 way people find out about issues. That's sort of, unfortunate sort of globally across the, sort of across what's normally going on out there. If you look across our customers, SMS is by a factor of 2 higher than any other delivery method for finding out about problems, that we tell you about. So that's sort of an interesting kind of compare and contrast against, sort of what's going out there in the wild versus, what we see on our platform. But monitoring and alerting in general is really a forcing function in the space. Whereas it used to you used to kind of use Nagios at the infrastructure level, and then maybe maybe a homegrown tool or something that was like really common 10 or 15 years ago. Now you're outsourcing more of your infrastructure to people like AWS or other cloud providers. They're actually kind of picking up the slack on that infrastructure layer because it's no longer kind of in your purview anymore for a lot of businesses. But what is happening is because of this rapid deployment chain, you're seeing a lot more monitoring solutions come up that are much higher in the stack. And the reason that they're happening is because it's kind of this virtuous circle. The people that are solving the problems are the software engineers. They want to look inside the software. They don't want to know if the router's working, right? So it's a much different behavioral pattern, and that's what's creating this explosion of monitoring tools that are targeted at very different people than historically they've been targeted at. So again, I think if anything, you'll see the Nagios, Pingdom, Isinga bubbles in this graphic get smaller, and the New Relics and the Datadogs and Sensus get larger.
Agreed. I think they already are.
Yeah, I can speak a little bit to this next slide here about alert fatigue is getting worse. We talked a little bit about that also with the email components. And 65% of people reported that it's a problem in their organization. And this one is a disheartening statistic. I feel so bad for everyone who carries that metaphorical pager, but 31% of respondents believe that over a quarter of alerts are false alarms. So this has real impact to the business in terms of people's trust and ability to respond appropriately to alarms if they don't actually think that they're real. So we dug into what were the most popular things that people are doing to reduce alert noise. So that has to do with obviously adjusting thresholds. So you're pushing code constantly. Make sure that your alarms are still valid and make sure that those thresholds are adjusted appropriately. And then 2, regularly evaluate and then delete superfluous alerts. As I just mentioned, you're pushing new code all the time. Make sure that that thing that's alarming is something that is actually actionable and something that your on-call person knows what to do about. And then also, not just, is the nature of alert something I should attend to, but is the nature of the alert something that is particular to my domain expertise? So ensuring that folks are routing incidents to specific people or teams. Way back on this slide, a few slides ago, we talked about how, I don't think it was mentioned out loud, but it's still pretty common to have sort of a 1-week rotation, right? This is a default, this is how people have done it forever, but you can get a lot more efficient and really decrease burnout if you're ensuring that the folks with the right domain expertise are actually the recipients of those types of alarms. So those are 3 steps that people talk about taking in order to try to tackle this issue of alert fatigue.
Joni, if I can, for folks on our audience who may not be familiar with the term alert fatigue, what exactly is that?
Well, our last survey actually dug into this maybe a little bit more, but it has to do with sort of the emotional of almost like post-traumatic stress that's associated with being responsible for these kinds of problems. So people who are on call and responsible for solving these issues are getting woken up in the middle of the night. They're commonly sleeping in different rooms than their significant other because they don't want to, they want to ensure that that person gets a good night's sleep. Or they joke about having, ghost pager leg because they're constantly being paged for things that are, interrupt their life. They have to stop what they're doing, open a machine, and get to work. So that level of fatigue on a human that's responsible for maintaining uptime is a very real thing. And so all of these things we just talked about are inputs to that end user having a lot of stress associated with this job. And companies like ours are very passionate about ensuring that people are getting more efficient, that this job is getting more efficient for the business, of course, because it's saving money, but also for the person on the end of that quote pager that has to deal with these things in their day-to-day life.
You can almost for half of this subject, replace fatigue with anxiety, because if it's the middle of the night, you're getting paged, and you don't necessarily, if you don't know what the problem is or it's in your area of domain, that's extremely, you're very anxious about that. You feel alone, and it's a bad situation. In companies that are a little more proactive about making sure that gets to the right place or using tools that allows them to specifically route, it's not so bad when you get that call and you know it's a part of the system you know intimately well. There's a lot less anxious, and the anxious and fatigue thing go really kind of hand in hand together.
Moving on to our next slide. We asked folks what were the most important tools they were using to solve the problem. So in the heat of the firefight, what is it that helps you to solve the problem? The number one answer was synchronous chat and collaboration tools. So anything that can help get people on the same page and talking about the same thing faster is going to help solve the problem. Additionally, as you would expect to see there, wiki articles, run books, graph tools, and then additionally phone calls. So sometimes you need to hop on a conference call to assist in the firefight. Additionally, this is a new question this year in the survey. We asked people how they communicate externally during an incident. So not just how you're talking to your team members during the firefight, but how are you communicating to others? Email was the number one answer, followed with status page, website, and Twitter. So now, as Todd mentioned earlier, people know that there are going to be outages, they know that things are going to happen, but now it's a matter of how quickly and truthfully you can communicate with your customers about that situation.
We talk a lot, internally here and externally about the idea of an incident life cycle and being on call. I would say, historically, if you go back, 3 or 4 years, it was more just like, hey, just tell me I have a problem, and then the rest of this was pretty loose, right? This whole idea of when a problem happens, it's really you want to solve it. It's not really learning about it. That's the value chain here. It's learning about it, getting the right people involved, and solve it quickly, because that's what you need to do in this, kind of where the market is at today, right? If you really embrace this idea of I can't be afraid to break it, then you have to be pretty sure that you understand sort of the whole life cycle, of being able to do that. So, so kind of, we look at it sort of, as according to this graphic here, which I said we've used like a lot of times, that the top 5%, 5%, the first 5% of an incident is kind of learning about it, and then most of the bulk of the activity is around solving it, right? Through triage, investigation, identification. 32% of people said triage was the most difficult element for them, and that's sort of that figuring out, geez, what part of the system, is it, right? I got to dig in just to figure out what is broken here, right? And things you can really do to help with that. As Tara talked about, wiki articles is a really classic thing. It's great if you can sort of tie the alerting and the article together so that you can sort of build those rules into the platform that's alerting you. So you sort of get a hint at what the problem might be right from the get-go. So it's really important to, it goes to the pain point, definitely, that people have said, is that you should spend some time with that. And then 19% said investigation was the most difficult element. And a lot of times, that's more people, right? It's just getting more eyeballs to kind of look at the problem, because, while the best organizations try to route, the problem to the right person, the majority of organizations still haven't achieved that goal. So getting more eyeballs is sort of the best way to get to that, nirvana. Well, maybe Joni can talk to resolution.
Yeah, so this one, it has a lot of threads, I think, with things that we've already talked about. But when we talk about how is it that you actually solve problems as an on-call person, over 70% stated that they have to work with at least one other person to help them solve a problem, right? The interesting stat here, too, is that only 13% report working with the NOC. And I apologize if this is your job and you're on the webinar, but the NOC is really becoming simply a traffic cop, right? Like, they're there to ensure that people are getting paged, but they're no longer delivering the same level of value that they used to be able to deliver when code was more consistent and unchanging. When code was more consistent and unchanging, there was a front line of people who could be there to try to solve problems and then escalate it. But that's not the way that things work anymore, and it's changing too fast in order to have that kind of one-layer tier know how to solve those problems. So in today's modern incident management, they're simply there to ensure that people receive a page. But that really doesn't address the problem that you see here, because if 71 people still need to collaborate with other folks in order to solve problems, there's a huge gap sort of in, I think, the two ways that those models might work. And then when you look at how long it takes to resolve issues, 42% of folks said it takes between 10 and 30 minutes on average to solve an issue. But an interesting stat here is it's still 10% of incidents take over an hour or 3 or more hours to resolve. So really speaking to efficiencies that can be gained when you work together as a team and collaborate to resolve issues.
Yeah, another way to look at that is 40% of all incidents take longer than 30 minutes. And, you know, in SaaS businesses, that's like the rest of your life, right? If you're a highly transactional business, you know, with revenue, but, you know, imagine like during the holidays, if an e-commerce site is down for 30 minutes, that's a big deal.
In the topic of resolution, we also asked survey respondents to tell us what is the top ways that you access the information you need to solve the problem. So when you are on call and you get that alert, where do you go to find out what to do? Internal wikis, runbooks again, graphite graphs. I think the interesting part of this slide are the anecdotal answers in terms of what people said has been the most valuable in helping them to solve problems faster. DevOps culture. If you write the code, you own the alerts, right? That's the big push right now. Additionally, runbooks, because then no matter who's on call, if you have a good runbook explaining how to solve the problem, then that's going to definitely speed things up. And having the right person with the right knowledge involved, or having the solution already documented. So those are all pretty obvious answers to how to solve the problem faster.
Not surprising, ChatOps is increasing. We're huge proponents of ChatOps here. Our evangelist wrote a book about it to kind of get people up to speed. There's a lot of interest in this space, and it really kind of goes to, you know, the idea of social coding and social, you know, fixing of problems, and the ability to kind of automate things that commonly need to be done. And there's all kinds of tools in this space that you can see listed there, including our own. This is something that you'll, I think, continue to see pick up. A critical piece of this, you know, that we believe in is you not only have to be able to execute that stuff, but you have to be able to kind of create that source of record, because that's what you're going to use in retrospective meetings, and also to make alerts smarter, to be able to attach remediation data to them. So again, I think ChatOps is one of those things that it's actually at the beginning of its life cycle. I think it's going to continue to dominate these reports going forward. Postmortems. This is a big deal. Oh yeah, go ahead, Joni. You take this one.
No, it's okay. I thought you were going to pass it to me.
No, you talk to customers all the time about it, so you're probably better.
Yeah. So this is interesting in terms of learning. So we talked a lot about, you know, what's generating the inputs that's coming into different people's systems. How are they fighting the fire? Who are they working with? But this topic is really about how are they learning from these issues. So we also phrased it with the word postmortem, which is sort of interesting, and I think introduces a little bit of bias, but we'll talk about that as we go through the statements. So half of the people we surveyed said that they had a defined postmortem process, and half said they didn't. That second half is a little concerning, right? And that we could firefight all day long, but that's not helping us get better as a team. But 66% responded that they only perform them after significant outages. So again, by nature of the word postmortem, it may be that, you know, they consider this like a catastrophic failure. Therefore, that's when they go ahead and undertake the process. But if you consider them a little bit more of like a retrospective, we definitely hope to see this trend change over time and add a little bit of maturity to this process. On the really positive side, having a lot to do with sort of DevOps culture, is that 81% of folks reported that they strive for blameless postmortems, which may be much of an awareness thing, right? 65% last year said that this was important to their culture, but we're seeing that there's a lot of knowledge existing in the market and a lot of conference speakers talking about how important it is to host these blameless postmortems in order to really not be afraid of our failures, right? Embrace them, learn from them, and understand how to move forward. And then once these reports today are generated, they're typically shared with their team internally and then different executive stakeholders. So this is something we definitely like seeing mature in this market, as sort of, closing the loop on the entire incident life cycle, not just starting with the page and who got paged and what was the mean time to act, right? But what did we learn from that entire life cycle of that incident?
Yeah, I think it's definitely a healthy process, and again, we talked about postmortems or retrospective, but this is key to IT and software and all the technical disciplines really being integrated into the company. I mean, I think unless like executive teams and other parts of the business really understand, the problems and solutions of the technical team, they'll always be relegated kind of to that back room. And the more you can conduct this stuff, collect data and reporting, the more tools you have as a technologist to represent what you need for the business. As a person that's been a CEO for a long time, it's historically very normal for some of my smartest guys to come in and say, we need, X, Y, Z. And I'll ask, why? And they'll go, because we do. That's not really an acceptable business answer, but embracing these kind of things and the tools and the reports and the ability to conduct these retrospectives gives you those tools to come in and say, because we've lost 72 hours of remediation to this specific area of the system that needs attention, right? That's real money, that's real time, and that's the right answer to get what you need as a technologist. And I think we see that behavior revolve around DevOps, which I think is a very healthy thing.
Okay, and this is our final slide here in terms of data from the survey. We asked people what other things that they are looking at or checking on in order to make themselves better as a team and better in their on-call process. Answers included documentation, checking on reporting, alert accuracy, and MTTR, which is mean time to resolution. Additionally, we got some really good anecdotal answers around people's final thoughts about being on call. I think the one that we can all agree with, it's about the most painful and stressful thing a job can ask you to do. I think there's a lot of people that agree with that. Additionally, knowledge sharing is a must, right? If all of the answers are in little Johnny's head and little Johnny is not on call or not available, you definitely want to make sure that you can find those answers someplace else. So documentation, and documentation that's not only up to date but also easy to find. So as we found out last year, this survey has been fantastic in terms of shedding light on the pain points of the people who are doing the hard job of being on call. We've definitely learned a lot, and we will be tweaking some of the questions and doing this again next year.
Excellent. Hey, Tara, Todd, and Joni, thank you so much for this presentation. And you can see the folks who helped Victor Ops spread the word and gather some of these responses. We do have quite a bit of questions, though, and we don't have a lot of time, unfortunately. We will try to get to as many of the questions as we can, and we do have them in writing. So we can go along. Tara, I know you've been answering some of these questions in writing as we go.
Yeah, I can. There have been a couple people who've asked if they're going to get a copy of the report or the survey, and as Alan mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, we will be sending everyone who's registered for the webinar their own copy of the survey. So you will have the slide deck and all of this data for your own to use. Additionally, we had someone who asked about Slack and HipChat as synchronous chat tools, and it's pretty funny because they actually asked that question before we got to the ChatOps slide. So yes, HipChat and Slack are both two of many tools that you can use in order to kind of get the ChatOps going in your organization. We use Slack here internally, but we have integrations with both.
Yeah, for both our tools. It's important. I think it's important to use the tools in kind of the synchronous kind of communication element of chat. Use the ones that work for your organization, but be sure, and this is why we focus on being able to integrate with both of them for our product, is it's important that you capture all of that remediation data. So when people use Slack with our product, we record all the Slack channel or the chat channel, so that you can reuse that data in retrospectives, but also attach them to inbound alerts. So it's kind of less about which tool you use and more about that you get kind of that full spectrum of not only the interaction, but the recording of it, the ability to kind of search and do retrospective reporting off of that data. It's more about the whole solution than any one specific part, I would say.
Great.
Alex?
Tara, did you also, I know one person had asked a few times about how many responses there were. I thought there was like over 600. Was that?
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, we got over 600 from a variety of different places. So we feel pretty confident in the answers that were given and the audience that we reached out to.
Okay, let's dive into something a little more substantive if we can here. Prachi asked, he said that, I think it was Todd might have said that if you just focused on keeping production pristine, then you're not being innovative and then you're not using a good model. Can you please elaborate on this? Does this mean that we should not be focusing on high availability for a SaaS application?
No, I think the two are slightly different things. Let me give you a kind of, my take on this, and I'll try not to be long-winded because I can be really long-winded on this. In my first company that we started in '97, it was a SaaS offering, and we would only release every 6 months. I mean, it was, in '97, that's kind of what you did. You got stability through not touching it. Once you got it into production, you'd lock the room, and literally we wouldn't let people in, in the room. Mm-hmm. And we control access to production systems like with an iron fist. But really, that's not what you want to do, because as a SaaS business specifically, your main competitive advantage is to innovate the platform, right? If you release something before somebody else, you're going to get a customer they didn't have, or you're going to keep a customer you had. So if you clamp down on it, you'll inevitably fall back to this model where you test the shit out of everything, and it's a month and a half before you do the next release. Instead, what you need to really concentrate on is the ability to recognize problems really fast when they're in production. And what you see with, my last company was in the ad tech space, it was literally impossible to test that code base in any way other than statistically. And because there was billions of transactions a day, we would push into production for a segment we push into production for a segment of sort of the customer base, which is people receiving sort of ads, and then we'd statistically compare that against the other part of the system, and if there was a change, we'd back it out and push it out, and then we would kind of then look at the data, and that's much more like what you're going to see in the future. I think that what's interesting, I love to talk about this subject, but I think what's very hard for companies, if you're a very early stage company and you hardly have any customers, you can kind of exhaustively test stuff, right? So that's a thing. If you're a really large company with high transaction amounts, like I just spoke of, you can statistically test things. If you're in that middle ground, that's where I think it gets really tough, because you might not have enough customer interaction or traction to be able to start to statistically notice things. And that's the blurry middle zone where I think companies have more problems. But if you look at the large ones, the Netflix and they're pushing hundreds of times a day. So they're unit testing, but they're largely finding problems in production and solving them really quickly and redeploying. And that's really the only way kind of to run your SaaS business going forward, I believe.
I agree with you, Todd. Unfortunately, guys, we do have a few more questions. We do have them in writing. Todd and Tara and Joni, we'll get them over to you, and perhaps you can, if you have a moment, can jot down some answers for people.
Absolutely.
Some of them are about the nature of that you can get the raw data to the survey and stuff. But that being said, it's the top of the hour, and we do have to be mindful of people's time. Time is a most valuable commodity. So with that being said, Todd, Vernon, Tara, Joni, Devops, thank you so much for giving us this insight into your State of On-Call report, your second annual State of On-Call survey and report, and sharing it with our audience today. Hope to have you back for the 3rd annual State of On-Call survey report next year, maybe.
We look forward to doing it, and maybe we'll come to Florida.
You know what? If it's going to snow, you're better off. We'll do it in person. And then, lastly, thank you to all of our attendees today for sitting in. We hope you found it valuable. We'll see you on our next DevOps.com webinar in our series. This is Alan Schimmel for DevOps.com, and thank you all for attending. Bye-bye.